Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President, and more. I would like to quickly mention we are on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. There are 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, bonus audio, video content, Pope coin coming soon, monthly drawings, early content, and ad-free content can be yours, and much, much more. All you have to do is sign up, and make sure you sign up early so that your name is on the top of the lists. Now, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Now, you well know by now that you can support the show on Patreon, but another great way to support the show is through your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. They really go a long, long way to helping me know what you like about the show, what I can make better, and as a bonus, it helps other people learn more about the show. Now, making his second appearance on this series of the Summer of Scholars, we have Mark Vinet of the History of North America podcast. Mark takes us through the real history, background, and context of the stunning 1991 historical drama Black Robe. Mark Vinet is the perfect guest to discuss this movie. He is Montreal born and bred. This is his history. Black Robe is a story of a French Jesuit who travels from the brand new settlement of Montreal across the unforgiving landscape of North America. This Jesuit meets new Native Aboriginal groups in his quest to spread Catholicism and battle his own demons. And now with our next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes in Rome and Christian Church. I'm very happy to be joined again by Mark Vinet of the History of North America podcast. And today we are going to really take a deep dive on a kind of a unique movie, the 1991 movie Black Robe. And this movie really brings in a lot of interesting facets of the history of the church, Catholicism, Native Americans, and the colonization of North America. And I really can't think of a better person with whom to talk to about this movie than none other than Mark Vinet of the History of North America podcast. And I would also like to thank listener Grant, who suggested this episode a long time ago. And I've been looking for the right guest to talk about this, and I've found the right guest to talk about this great movie. But before we get started, Mark, why don't you just give us a little bit about your background?
Well, thanks, Steve. It's wonderful to be with you. I've chosen to present the eclectic history of North America in a series of detailed episodes during which I attempt to share with my audience in a positive manner the sweeping saga of the continent from its deep history origins to our present epoch. For the purposes of my podcast, I define North America to include the USA, Canada, and Mexico. I explore the interesting, compelling, inspiring, and tragic stories of these 3 great nations, their inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, and respective geographies. My goal is to search for the multiple causes that led to the thrilling story of North America, an action-packed tale that's still unfolding. I voyage back to earlier times and investigate incidents that set in motion a series of events that help explain the close relationship, but sometimes contentious relationship of these 3 continental neighbors. The United States, Mexico, and Canada have many important features and attributes in common. It's not surprising, therefore, that the history of the exploration and subsequent settlement of these 3 countries are closely interrelated. The complete history of these three nations cannot be properly analyzed and understood without reference to the history of the other. Part of this saga brings us today to the motion picture Black Robe, which is set in the northeastern part of North America.
And I should mention for people who are new listeners and old listeners that we will be giving spoilers in this. We're taking a deep dive, so we're going to be dissecting a lot of different parts of the movie. So as always, I mean, it's up to you how you want to watch it, but I always suggest watch the movie, listen to to an episode of Beyond the Big Screen, and then watch the movie again, and you'll get so much more out of the movie. This movie is not always easy to access, and you're based in Canada. Was it any easier for you to access it?
Well, Steve, I have an extensive personal collection of history films that I've amassed over many years. My library of movies includes digital files, Blu-ray, DVD, and believe it or not, Black Robe on VHS.
Oh, wow.
When handling the cassette, my kids looked at me with total incredulity and stupefaction. The image was a bit grainy and low res, but it did the job. How did you watch the movie?
And you had an actual working VHS too?
Oh, yes. I have a lot of VHS cassettes in my library that I don't want to discard because some of them haven't been duplicated to digital yet. So I do have a few working machines. That's how I was able to watch Black Robe. But like I said, it got the job done.
Yeah, it sure did.
How did you watch the movie?
I was able to find it on YouTube, and it was grainy, so it looks like somebody probably did digitize their VHS version of the movie. It wasn't available on Amazon Prime, but it may have been available in the specific country stores. It just wasn't available on the US. But you don't have to go too very hard to find a copy of this. Especially your library might have it in the back catalog in either VHS or DVD as well. So you can definitely get a copy of it.
As a piece of pure entertainment, Steve, I think this movie has its flaws. But as a portrayal of history on film, I found it very mature, nuanced, realistic, interesting, and effective. It's a combination of top talents delivering a gripping and tragic story and a meticulously researched representation of Indigenous life with dialogue in the Cree, Mohawk, and Algonquin languages.
Yeah, that's what I kind of went back and forth with this movie, is that it was very rich in history, but as a film, it lacked in a couple of areas, which I think will probably focus more on the historical side and the context side, but it probably will come up at times that some of the entertainment value wasn't quite there.
The film is set in New France, my corner of the world. The French established an extensive colony in the New World from 1534 to 1763. Our movie takes place exactly 100 years after Jacques Cartier first sailed up the mighty St. Lawrence River to the place where the film begins, Quebec City, formerly known as the Aboriginal village of Stadacona. And for all you folks out there who have never been up to Canada and visit Quebec City, it's something that you should put on your bucket list because it's one of the most beautiful cities in North America.
I absolutely love Quebec City. I think that it could possibly be my most favorite place in the whole world. You're in Europe, but you're not in Europe. It oozes history. Every corner you go through, you feel like you're in a European village, but you're also not in a European village. It's definitely it's sort of like New Orleans, but I think much nicer than New Orleans. Not any knock to New Orleans.
Well, some consider Quebec City as one of the jewels of North America, and I think it's definitely worth a visit. And it's there during the first years of the settlement that we actually meet the village's or the settlement's founder and governor, Samuel de Champlain, 1 year before his death in 1635. I've seen the man represented in different movies and TV series as a younger man, but here we see him as an older gentleman. I think it's an interesting characterization of him, which takes place at the beginning of the movie.
Maybe before we dive too deep into the movie, this movie was an interesting background on how it was produced is interesting. It's actually a Canadian-Australian co-production. and it's based on a novel of the same name, Black Robe, which I've been going to read the novel. It's on my to-read list. It's tracing the adventures, basically, of a French Jesuit priest. The main cast, which I think it was casted very well, was predominantly Canadian and Native Aboriginal actors. August Schellenberg is probably the most marquee name on the cast, but also it features Raul Trujillo in a smaller role, who he was one of the main characters in another film that Mark and I discussed, Apocalypto. So it's a very interesting cast.
Actually, as you mentioned, it is a Canadian and Australian co-production. And in order for these type of international films to be made, not only do both countries have to pony up some money, but they also have to contribute with regards to the talent. And I think the Australian government and tax credits, tax breaks, and grants ponied up some money in exchange for an Australian director. And also one of the main stars, I think, is partly Australian. So that's how it became a Canadian and Australian co-production, which isn't obvious when you watch the movie.
No.
It's a total Canadian experience, a Northeastern North American movie, and we have Australia that's part of it.
Maybe a good place to start off is describing a bit of the geography of this land, because it is an extreme place where this movie happens climate-wise. I mean, now you can live in Quebec and you get in your car and you're heating, but these people were living in huts and houses that they're just carving out of the wilderness. And if I had to put a pin anywhere in the map, that probably wouldn't be the first place I would be to camping. Tell us a little bit about the geography and the climate of this area.
The key to understanding this movie is the fur trade. The fur trade involved beavers, and beavers only lived in northern areas of North America where there was snow, where there was cold, and that's why their pelts were so sought after, because it was their protection against the weather and the cold, and thus those furs were in high demand in European markets.
And now a word from our sponsors. Yeah, we're dealing with the cold area, extreme winters, and I believe they said that this is in the beginning that the movie is starting going into fall, going into the winter. So they're not going to be experiencing a beautiful summer in Quebec. They're getting the full front of the winter.
The main protagonist, the priest, the Jesuit priest, is being asked to travel 1,500 miles in this weather in order to attain his goal, which is a Huron village. Black Robe gives us a mature portrayal of Amerindians, something that we're used to today in modern films and TV series, but was still somewhat new in 1991 when this film was made. Back in the days of old Hollywood, Indians, as they were then called, or as they then called Native North Americans, were usually depicted as superficial characters lacking in depth. Black Robe instead shows Amerindians as the multidimensional individuals that they were.
Yeah, I guess briefly, the Jesuits, they were a monastic order who were missionaries. Predominantly, to contrast them, I did an episode with another podcast about the mission system that the Spanish used in Texas and northern Mexico. The monastic orders that led that were the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So they're all Roman Catholics. But the Franciscans and the Dominicans used similar methods, but different methods. The French were primarily using the Jesuits as to spread Christianity amongst the Native Americans. So that's where they give us some foreshadowing of what could happen to the Jesuit, who they call Black Robe. And that's where the name comes from in the movie. In France, where he meets the Jesuit priest, and that scene in the cathedral where the priest I believe his ear was gone and half of his face was scarred from burning and he was missing part of his hand. It was foreshadowed and implied that happened by the Native Americans to him. So the Jesuit priest, Black Robe, he knows he's in for it and that it's not going to be an easy walk in the park when he gets to New France.
Oh, definitely. Most Algonquin Huron settlements lived by hunting and fishing, and Catholic Jesuit priests from France lived amongst them. The nations of the Iroquois Confederacy considered the Jesuits legitimate targets of their raids and warfare, as the missionaries were nominally allies of the Huron and French fur traders. Retaliating for French colonial attacks against the Iroquois was also a reason for their raids against the Huron and Jesuits. We cannot minimize, Steve, the importance of religion in the 17th century. One should not underestimate the Christian need to evangelize, to spread the word of God and share the good news of Jesus with all peoples of the earth in order to bring on the end time. Preaching to Amerindians was fraught with danger, as you mentioned. The Iroquois did not take nicely to the Jesuit door-knocking and often mocked and mistreated these evangelists. The Canadian martyrs, and they're known as the Canadian martyrs, were 8 Jesuit missionaries ritually tortured and killed during the warfare between the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawk people, and the Huron. These priests were subsequently venerated as martyrs by the Catholic Church and canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1930. Shrines have been erected, churches and schools dedicated, and municipalities named after the Canadian martyrs. When growing up in French Catholic Quebec, I was taught stories of the bravery exemplified by these holy men, with one in particular standing out, Father Jean de Brébeuf, who died a violent death in what is now southern Ontario in 1649. In 1940, he was proclaimed one of the patron saints of Canada by Pope Pius XII, and in 1984, Pope John Paul II prayed over Brébeuf's skull before joining in an outdoor ecumenical service on the grounds of the nearby Martyrs' Shrine. The service mixed pre-Christian First Nation ritual with Catholic liturgy and was attended by an estimated 75,000 people. The Jesuit priests were not universally trusted. Many Amerindians considered them to be malevolent shamans who brought death and disease wherever they traveled. On the other hand, the Huron sorcerer or shaman in the movie is jealous of the priest's influence over the Algonquins and is as arrogant, adamant, and unflinching in his beliefs as the Jesuit priest. Both men use their faith, supposed secret knowledge, and spiritual connections as power to frighten, influence, and ultimately rule other humans. The huge difference between the two faiths is that only Christianity has an evangelical mission that has been a powerful catalyst through the Common Era for much good, bad, positive, and negative brought to the world. Native beliefs resemble Judaism, for example, which has no evangelical element. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but it seems to me that Jews, like Amerindians, are born into their faith and feel no need to convince others to convert and join their faith.
That's an interesting question. That's kind of where Judaism has evolved to this point, and it's probably way outside of the scope of this particular episode. But in earlier times, probably about the times of what's called the Second Temple Judaism, going into the early part of the Common Era, Judaism was much more of a proselytizing religion. But as you said, now over the course of centuries, it's evolved more into the religion of a people. But even at that point in the Second Temple, there were Jews who believed that you were born into Judaism and it was a religion of a people. But definitely that's common amongst religions around the world, is that your religion is inextricably tied up with your culture and your nation or tribe, where it's not so internationalized as Christianity and, say, Islam are.
I would like to get your reaction, Steve, on this comment from the director, and I quote, "I think that even if you have no religious faith whatsoever, or even if you despise the Jesuits, you would still find it an interesting story. It's a wonderful story of obsession and love, and it is a wonderful adventure of the spirit and of the body. What those people did, going to a country where winters were far more severe than anything they had known in Europe, meeting people who were far more fierce than anyone they had ever encountered, having to deal with these people showing us something of humanity at its greatest. It's the equivalent of today's people getting into space shuttles and going off into space. It takes unbelievable courage to do this."
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that no matter what you think about Jesuits or that whole enterprise, especially the French, there was no guarantee that their colony was going to last. I mean, like you said, they were on other people's land who, in many cases, they were enemies with. They had allied with some Native Americans, they were enemies with others. They had other European enemies as well that were settling colonies in that area. The harshness of the land, it bred a certain toughness in the Native Americans, and just that adventure that they had going through the beaver trails. Trail isn't exactly the right word I'm thinking of, but I think they said right up front, I think it was even Samuel de Champlain who said, you're going to be rowing 12 hours a day. And I can't imagine that a young Jesuit was in anywhere near the physical condition required of the adventure that he was taking.
As mentioned, the culture clash in Black Robe is dramatic and cannot be underestimated. One key scene has an Algonquin asking another tribesman, "Are these foreigners intelligent?" The answer given was a terse and categorical no. To me, Steve, this scene was telling. A lot has been said about European negative evaluations and impressions of Native Americans, but the same can be said in reverse. In many ways, I'm sure Amerindians at the time felt morally superior to these foreigners despite their technological advances. It was European advantages in technology, the unwitting transmission of diseases, and eventually sheer superiority in numbers that would overwhelm these native societies. The natives quickly became dependent on European manufactured goods, products, and weapons. This ominous fact is alluded to in the movie by the main Huron protagonist, brilliantly played by the award-winning Canadian actor August Schellenberg, as you mentioned. Initially, Europeans, especially the French, sought to trade, not conquer. But as the fur trade moved further west and slowly diminished in importance, land cultivation took hold. Europeans displaced the First Nations. As mentioned, native North Americans were technologically wanting, and this put them at a great disadvantage when faced with invaders that were at first technologically superior and later numerically superior.
Yeah, I think that that's the really interesting part is with them going through these different areas and running up against the different groups. So I believe was the group that was Black Robe's guide to get him to the Huron villages, were they the Algonquins?
Yes, they were.
So they had their own unique culture. I think that was one of the great things that they displayed in this movie is they weren't just all generic central casting Indians like in, I'm using air quotes here, like they had maybe would have done in a John Wayne Western 50 years ago. It seemed to take a lot of time to show the really distinct aspects of each of their cultures.
Native peoples in these films were shown as living harmoniously and peacefully until the inevitable encroachment of the violent white army and settlers who were the harmful disruptive influence on Amerindian culture and landscape. These representations were far from the days of whitewashing in pre-60s traditional depictions of Native peoples, where white actors, as you mentioned in the old John Wayne movies, were cast for roles not meant for them. When instead of hiring someone that fit the intended race or ethnicity of a character, a white person was traditionally given that role. Old Hollywood whitewashing had a two-pronged effect, for not only did it impede Native American representation in film, but it also forced them into stereotypical roles. Some believe, however, that the pendulum has swung from one extreme to the other and that nowadays a simplistic one-dimensional depiction of both cultures has returned to the big screen, but in a totally opposite way or reverse manner. Some feel Amerindians are now often depicted as flawless and virtuous victims, while Euro-Americans are portrayed as cardboard villains. I believe that both extremes of the spectrum, gamut, or pendulum are simplistic, immature, unsophisticated, false, childish, and ultimately boring. Two wrongs don't make a right. I found that the truth usually lies in the middle. All human history is awash in gray. Simple-minded, bipolar interpretations and presentations are a waste of time. All peoples and cultures should be portrayed in the arts as they appear in the real world. Multifaceted, complex beings. In other words, the good, the bad, the positive, the negative, the culture, the cruelty, the beauty, the brutality, the sophistication, and the savagery. And I think Black Robe does a good job in doing this.
Yeah, I really do think it uniquely amongst the movies that I've seen. I mean, this one's going back 30 years ago, but I think it really was unique in that aspect. It portrayed initially the Algonquins who were, I believe they were hired to bring, Lefork was his name, but Black Robe to the Huron village. That stuck with me when I was doing a little bit of reading. The Hurons lived, if I'm not mistaken, on the other side of the Great Lakes in modern day Wisconsin, Michigan area. So that's a lot of traveling that they had to do to get from Quebec City all the way to, at the very least, across the entirety of New York State, the Niagara Peninsula of Canada, through Michigan. They covered a lot of territory.
They did. The Huron tribes were scattered throughout Quebec, Ontario, and into the Great Lakes region. The movie depicts a priest wanting or being sent by the powers that be in his religious order to the limits of the Huron nation. That whole voyage is, of course, what we're accompanying the priest on in this movie, but it shows the distances and also the willingness of this religious order and of these priests and these individuals to go about their work, which is quite fascinating to our modern senses. But I have to come back once again to the culture shock on both sides, which we should never underestimate. For example, the natives in the film cannot understand why French priests refrain from relations with women. They view this as strange and even demonic. On the other hand, the uninhibited, free, and natural love practiced by the natives is viewed as strange, primitive, and sinful by the priests. Once again, the cultural gaps and misunderstandings were enormous. History irrefutably teaches us that all human beings have the potential of being evil, and when given the power and opportunity, they are. The universal principle of force and might make right applies to all people, cultures, nations, and continents throughout world history, including North America's pre-Columbian societies. This film shows us humanity at all its best and worst. Amerindian way of life was not inferior or superior, it was just different. In certain areas, among certain tribes, warfare and feuding were endemic. Also, Aboriginal arrival and presence on the continent had serious environmental consequences. For example, some believe Paleo-Americans hunted certain megafauna to extinction. I invite the audience to check out episodes 3 to 11 of my podcast for more on all of this. Also, in the great unwitting exchange of bacteria, viruses, and infectious diseases that transpired between the peoples of two worlds, unfortunately for the North American indigenous peoples, it was they who got the shorter end of the stick and thus inadvertently suffered most. In the 16th century, Eurasian diseases such as smallpox and measles, which were endemic among the colonists but new to North America, caused the deaths of 90% of the indigenous people, resulting in great losses to their societies and cultures. Europeans thus unknowingly unleashed a form of bacterial epidemic to which Aboriginal peoples had no immunity that ravaged the original inhabitants of the continent. After European contact, Amerindians suffered high fatalities of Eurasian diseases. Studies have shown the diseases were likely carried by the increased number of immigrants in cities and nations where smallpox was prevalent, such as France, England, and the Netherlands. The film highlights several tribes that inhabited northeastern North America. There were the Algonquin, part of the Huron Nation, the Montagnais, which were depicted at one point in the movie, and then the Iroquois, the Mohawks. The Montagnais at first are depicted as having never actually met Europeans, so that was a moment of first contact, which occurred between those people and them actually seeing Europeans for the first time, and they make some comments about their bearded faces, saying that they looked like dogs. With regards to the Iroquois, they are not depicted in a good light at all points in this movie, and there were some critics who objected to that.
And now a word from our sponsors. The main conflict of the movie is this group, Algonquins, who are transporting Black Robe to the Huron villages. They run into a group of Iroquois, or I believe they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, and it was specifically a group of Mohawks. They were portrayed as very warlike people. Can you tell us a little bit about them? And they are kind of the buffer between the French colonies and the Dutch, because I believe at one time the Iroquois said that maybe they'll just trade Le Fork to the Dutch for guns and manufactured goods. So how did the Mohawk and the Iroquois fit into that situation?
Well, at the time, the Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron nations were enemies. One of the reasons why they were enemies during the early colonization of the continent by Europeans was the fur trade. And who would control the fur trade? Who would supply the Europeans with the furs and control of the corresponding territories? With regards to the French living in New France and the fur trade, the Hurons were allies of the French, and the Iroquois thus saw the French as being enemies and saw these Jesuit priests who seemed to be only bringing disease and mayhem wherever they went as the enemy, and that's why they were very belligerent towards them.
Yeah, and in the movie they portrayed their village. They had a massive stockade around their town. They had huge buildings. I mean, it was a very sophisticated setup that they had.
Well, the Amerindians of northeastern North America did live in sophisticated societies, and actually some of their government structure was used as a model later on, even in the founding of the United States. So a lot of light has been shed on this in the past few decades, which is something that is to be appreciated not only by historians, but fans of historians, and also bringing to light the positive side of Amerindians to what has not always been a kind approach when it comes to the historiosity of their culture.
I'm definitely looking forward to in your podcast, and it's probably a deep, deep dive, is at some point I'd love to hear and maybe talk about, we discussed in our previous collaboration the movie Apocalypto, which you should definitely listen to that episode as well. But the connections, if there was any connections between these cultures of the South and then these cultures in the Northeast, that's got to be a fascinating story. And I don't know how much is even known at this point about any sort of trade networks or intellectual passages between the two cultures.
Well, we see a lot of that come to light during the American Civil War, which is a lot later than our movie's setting. But during the American Civil War, the Canadian colonies, who do a lot of business with the American colonies or the American states at the time, they have to take sides along with the British government. The decisions they make with regards to supporting the North or the South has a lot to do with trade.
And was there a lot of trade between the Native Americans of Mesoamerica and the Native Americans of, say, the northeast of, including Quebec and southern Ontario and the northeastern section of the U.S. of the Iroquois that lived there and the Algonquins that lived in that region and the Cree?
Well, during the pre-Columbian years, there wasn't a lot of direct trade because of the distance, but there was indirect trade in that items that had been traded in approximate way had trickled down to both cultures. So we find often Mesoamerican items, art and artifacts that are found up in northern North America because they were traded basically from one tribe to the next, from one nation to the next, from one area to the next, and moved their way all the way up to the northern part of the continent and vice versa.
You bring up a really interesting point there of the vastness of this land. Now, in just this movie, they go about 1,500 miles approximately, and that's really not that far into the continent of North America. But in European terms, that's the distance from London to Moscow. The density in Europe and in that section of the old world is so much more. And in the North American context, it's just so sprawling, the amount of land that would need to be covered by both the Native Americans and these French people who are colonizing and spreading into these areas.
One thing that we must always remember is that looking back in history, we have to try and understand what these folks were living through. And one of the things that they experienced was overcoming distance. And as you mentioned, 1,500 miles in today's terms can be easily overcome. But back then, it was an adventure of a lifetime when most folks didn't even leave the periphery of their villages. When the director mentioned that traveling from Europe to the Americas at the time of colonization was like flying to the moon, I don't think that's overestimated. It's a grand journey, the distances are huge, and those who embark on those journeys and want to meet all the challenges going along, those are a special breed of people, definitely.
Yeah, in the movie, most of their travel is done in canoe, and you just have to think about that. When they're canoeing, everything they need has to be in those canoes. And when they stop, it's not like they're going to be able to stop at a restaurant. It was the very rare native village that they even passed by. They were completely on your own. And I think that probably something like space travel is a great analogy in that they had to completely take care of themselves at every step of the way.
Well, that's why Europeans were so dependent on Amerindians during the first decades and even the first century upon their arrival, because they needed Amerindians to survive. Amerindians were used to living in those areas. They had adapted over centuries and even millennia, and they were able to help the Europeans to also adapt and even, in some cases, survive.
It's probably interesting to get towards the final scenes of the movie. They leave Quebec City with a fairly sizable party of maybe 20 plus people, mostly Native American Algonquin people, but then also Black Robe, the Jesuit, and one other Frenchman. And by the time they get to the Algonquin village, it's pretty much just the Black Robe at that point. Some of the party went on their own way. Most of them actually died. So I think that shows you the level of attrition that a group would take going through there. But maybe tell us a little bit about that village when Black Robe finally gets there.
Well, I think the end of the movie is quite telling and ironic, because after this long, arduous, challenging journey, our protagonist priest makes it to the village alive, hoping to spread the good news and to be part of this growing Christian community. What he finds instead is that his compatriots, the French Jesuit priests, have been murdered, and there's only one left alive. In the village, there is total panic and despair because of diseases. Not understanding the transmission of viruses back then, the people were very wary of the Jesuit priests, the new arrivals, the foreigners, who they thought had brought these diseases in some demonic form. It's obviously not the paradise that the young priest was hoping to arrive at. Instead, it is his job to try and find some way of living alongside these people, because although he's a new arrival, he's the only one left when the older priest that greeted him died shortly thereafter. The movie ends with the priest actually baptizing the Amerindians and giving them hope that this baptism will free them from this terrible plague, the plague that is killing their villagers. You also get the impression that Amerindians, the Hurons in the movie at the end, were not very sincere in their conversion. They were basically willing to do anything to get rid of this pestilence, and therefore accepted to be baptized and to be, in a way, I guess, traitors to their own culture, but as a means of survival. In other words, we've got nothing to lose at this point. He wants to baptize us. He says that it'll save us. So be it.
Yeah, I think.
But the final text that appears on the screen at the end of the movie gives us the results, in that 15 years later, most of the Hurons in that village had died of the pestilence, and the Jesuit priests basically abandoned those missions and went back to Quebec City, and many of them back to France.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the movie. Leforque, you never get a really good sense. He seems to institutionally maybe believe in the church, but you don't know how deep the faith even runs through him. Like, he wants to baptize people, and he seems outwardly convinced of his faith, but he doesn't always necessarily seem internally completely convinced. But it feels like he's just being pushed along by the currents, as much as the metaphorical currents of the water of them going to this tribe, but also just that there's a lot of pressure on him to do this, to reach this goal. And he does it, and he baptizes them. And maybe that is some of the acting in the movie, where we said the entertainment wise that it wasn't always maybe the acting was a little not great. I wasn't 100% sure of his internal conviction.
What I enjoyed about the depiction of the priest is that it was a nuanced and sophisticated and mature look at how the Jesuit priests were trying to do good. Now, we can look back hundreds of years later and say, how dare they have done that? But at the time, they thought they were doing good. They sincerely, in good faith, thought that they were bringing good news to the Amerindians, who were ignorant at the time of Jesus Christ. They were not aware of Christianity, and therefore it was their job and part of their evangelization to get out there, overcome the obstacles, and hopefully convert and baptize these people so that they could one day reach paradise. And we hear the priest, the protagonist, LaForge, constantly mention the word paradise throughout the movie, because that's his ultimate goal. He thinks that he's doing good, and what he's doing will lead him to paradise. And he's also convinced that if the Amerindians accept his message, are converted and baptized, that they too will find paradise. So this is heavy stuff for those folks back then. We can't underestimate that. Looking at it from a contemporary or modern viewpoint, this was very serious and important to them. In the same way that the Amerindians throughout the movie, we see how their religion is important to them and how they are convinced that their beliefs will bring them happiness after death. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, this discussion, we cannot underestimate the culture clash, and we cannot underestimate the difference in religions and how fervently each group believed in their cause.
Yeah, you could see that in so many different ways that their cultures just did not mesh. But then on a human level, August Schellenberg's character, his daughter, became involved in a relationship with the French person. And I think that's an interesting aspect of the French experience in colonization, that it seemed like the French, throughout their colonization of North America, definitely intermeshed and became more a part of Native culture than maybe, say, the English did.
Well, we actually here in Canada have different groups of Native peoples who are considered Métis, which is an Aboriginal word for a mixture of two cultures, a mixture of the French culture and a mixture of the Amerindian culture. So, yes, there was a lot of interaction between both cultures up here in Canada, as there was also elsewhere throughout North America, and the same case can be made for Mesoamerica with regards to the Spanish. So human beings, in whatever place they find themselves, or in whatever civilization or society or culture they find themselves, it all boils down to very basic values. And when you study history for long enough, you realize that all the superficial things that sometimes we focus too much on, be it language, color of skin, sex, female, male, culture, regional differences. When you boil all that down, it's a cliche to say we all have so much in common, but I think it's very true, and history shows that to us every time.
Maybe just to wrap up, what are some of your final takeaways from this movie? And what do you think that somebody watching this movie for the first time, or maybe the second time they watched it, they've listened to this podcast and they maybe want to revisit the movie, what should they really be looking for in this movie?
Well, firstly, history is complicated. There are accolades for some and blame for others. Too often, present-day historical scholarship focuses on a tale of woe and oppression regarding Western civilization. They ignore the many accomplishments to instead dwell on the negative, the faults, and the shortcomings. A new, fair, delicate balance is needed in our historical analysis, and I think this film is a good example. By the way, an interesting topic to research, study, and present, and I'm speaking to the young folks out there, the young budding historians, is the history of history. And what I mean by this is the study of how historians have interpreted and presented the past over time. The 19th century view of Amerindians is regarded now as being much different than ours today. For example, how have Native peoples been seen through the historical lens in different eras? What about the evolution of the word savage? Because we hear that word a few times in the movie. The actual word savage, or sauvage in French, has evolved over the centuries and has been used differently, different connotations. The pendulum of historical interpretation too often swings from one extreme to the other. This indelible fact should be brought to light. In the end, I find that if you're working, studying, and interpreting in the middle zone, that's where you'll often find the truth.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely the thought to leave people with. And if people want to, and they definitely should, go listen to your podcast, how can they find you and your podcast?
Everything about my projects and activities can be found at markvinet.com. That's markvinet.com. There you will find info regarding my History of North America podcast and videocast series, along with details regarding the many books I have authored, including Da Vinci Code meets Mission Impossible, international historical mystery and suspense thrillers, available in print and digital format on Amazon.
That's awesome. Thank you again for coming on the show, and I think people are going to hear more from you, and I hope they do.
Well, thank you, Steve, for once again granting me the great honor and privilege of sharing your wonderful audience. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we get to do it again soon.